Why are Jewish educators only mentioning half of the story and totally ignoring the other half? They're not even mentioning that there's a biblical commandment to rebuild the temple. Rav Sajagon, the Rambam, the Sefer HaChinuch, the Smag, and the Or HaChaim all explicitly say that there's a biblical commandment from the Torah to rebuild the third and final temple in Jerusalem. How do you just say that it's going to be built by God and not mention any of these other sources? So there's a very common belief amongst many Orthodox Jews that the future temple that we're all praying for every single day will be built by God himself and not by humans. And many say that it will fall from the sky. I was actually eating a Shabbos meal with someone the other day, the wife of a rabbi in a very big yeshiva, and she herself told me that she's just waiting for the day where she can see that the temple will fall onto the Temple Mount and she'll know that the day has come. This is certainly what I was taught in Jewish education. Let me know what you guys were taught in day school or yeshivas and how you were brought up. In any case, let's take a look at the following video put out by That Jewish Family, a very well-known Instagram and Facebook page that spreads Judaism to Jewish people and to the world. And they made a video on how the third temple will be rebuilt. Let's take a look.
How will the third temple be built?
By the way, the Beis Hamikdash, the Holy Temple in Jerusalem, we believe the first two temples were built out of stone. The Midrash says the third Beis Hamikdash will be built out of tears of devotion, of determination. It won't be built by man. The third temple will be built by God himself. So every mitzvah you do is a spiritual brick in bringing Mashiach closer, to bring the world together with unity, love, and goodness and kindness. Goodness and kindness speak so much louder than all the destruction in the world.
So the rabbi claims in this video that as opposed to the first two temples, the third temple will actually be built by God himself, and every mitzvah that we do as Jews builds a spiritual brick in the future temple that seemingly will fall from the sky. This is what's taught in many day schools and in many yeshivas, and we're all going to see plop the temple onto the Temple Mount one day, and we're all going to know that the Messiah has come, and everyone magically will turn into God-believing and God-fearing people, and the whole world will be perfect. Now, I would like to say that I tremendously respect the rabbi in this video and That Jewish Family, and I do not want to speak down to or disparage That Jewish Family. We love That Jewish Family, and we're very excited for them to come back to the land of Israel speedily in our days with the rebuilding of the temple. However, I believe that this video is slightly misleading. Let's go through the sources and see what the Torah actually has to say about the third temple. So I was not able to find the Midrash that the rabbi quoted. If anyone knows the source of this Midrash, please let me know. I'd love to see it. However, the main source of this belief is Rashi, a famous commentator on the Talmud, in two places, in Sukkah 41a and Rosh Hashanah 30a, explicitly writes that the future temple that we're all waiting for will come from the sky, and he quotes Shemos, Exodus 15:17, Mikdash Hashem konenu yadecha, the temple you, God, prepared with your hands. Now, why does Rashi say this over there on the Gemara? So the Gemara is discussing over there the biblical prohibition mentioned in Vayikra, Leviticus 23:14, that we're not allowed to partake of any new grains that took root this year until we bring the Omer offering, which is a barley offering brought on the second day of Passover in the temple. Now, what happens when there is no temple? So when can we partake of the new grains when there's no barley offering being brought on the second day of Passover? So biblically, all new grains are permitted on the second day of Passover as soon as the sun rises, when there's no temple. However, when the second temple was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a very well-known rabbi that was living during the period of the destruction of the second temple, decreed that we have to wait to the end of the second day of Passover in order to partake of the new grains. Now, the question is, why did Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai make this decree? So the Talmud explains that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had a concern that perhaps when the third temple will be rebuilt, it will be rebuilt on either the first day of Passover, which is a Yom Tov, it's a holiday, where no work may be performed, or maybe it will be rebuilt on the second night of Passover, when they are cutting the new barley and preparing it for the next day's offering in the temple to permit the new grains. Now, Rashi asks a question on this, however. There is another Gemara in Shavuos 15b that explicitly states that we don't build the temple on Yom Tov, nor at night. So how can Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai have this concern that the temple will be rebuilt on the first day of Passover, which is Yom Tov, or the second day of Passover at night? These two times are not fitting for the rebuilding of the temple. And to this question, Rashi answers and says that the law that we don't build the temple at night or on Yom Tov is only in regards to a temple built by human hands. However, the future temple that we're all waiting for is going to be built by God himself. And those who agree with Rashi on this particular passage in the Talmud is Tosfos, the Tosfos HaRosh as well, and the Ritva, all quote Rashi's explanation of this Gemara that the future temple will come down from the sky. Are there any other sources that support Rashi's view? The answer is yes. There are a number of Midrashim that maybe indicate that God himself will build the temple. For example, Yalkut Shimoni 848 on Tanakh explicitly says that King Solomon built the first temple and it was destroyed. The second temple was built by Ezra, but the third temple, Ata La'orech Yamim, God, seemingly, the implication is that God will build the third temple. Another source is in Peskita Rabasi, which includes a prayer that God rebuild the temple. A third source in the Mechilta Shira 10:5 says that God founded the earth with one hand, based on a pasuk in Yeshaya, Isaiah 48:13, Af Yadi Yasida Eretz, with my hand in the singular, founded the earth, God says. Whereas when it talks about the temple in Shemos, Exodus 15:17, it says, Mikdash Hashem konenu yadecha, your hands, God prepared the temple, in the plural, implying that God himself will rebuild the future temple. Now, it is worthy to note that actually 3 passages earlier in this Mechilta, it explicitly says that the Jewish people will rebuild the temple. In the plural, v'yivnu, they will build the temple. So there is a little bit of a discrepancy within the Mechilta itself as to who will rebuild the temple. In addition, the Zohar in Bereishis 128 says that God himself will rebuild the temple, and therefore this temple will never be destroyed, as opposed to the first 2 temples, which were built by man, and they were destroyed. Up until now, we've quoted many sources that seem to indicate that the future temple will be built by God, and it sounds like there's a very good case to believe in this. On the other hand, it is worthy of noting that there is absolutely no explicit prophecy in the entire Tanakh of such a miraculous miracle that the future temple will come down from the sky. And in fact, actually, we see the exact opposite in Tanakh. The book of Yehezkel, chapters 40 through 48, are entirely Messianic, and chapters 40 through 43 almost entirely deal with the laws, the measurements, and the design of the future temple. So there's an explicit prophecy in the book of Yehezkel, Ezekiel 43:11, that the Jewish people will rebuild the temple. Ve'es kol chukosav, v'chol tzurosav, v'chol torasav, hoda'osam, uchsov le'enehem, v'yishmeru, as kol tzurosav, as kol chukosav, ve'asuosam. And all its laws, and all its designs, and all its teachings make known to them, and write it down in their sight, so that they safeguard its entire form and its laws, and they will do them. Meaning we have an explicit prophecy in Yehezkel that they will do them. Who is the they that Yehezkel is saying? Seemingly it's talking explicitly to the Jewish people, that the Jewish people will rebuild the temple. And indeed, all the major commentators on the page explicitly write this, including Rashi himself, the Radak, the Metzudos David, and the Malbim all explicitly write that the whole point of the passages in Ezekiel 40 through 43, detailing the rebuilding of the future temple and all of its measurements, are for the people to know what the measurements are so that they can rebuild them. In fact, the Radak and Metzudos David see this as an indication of the revival of the dead, that the people that Yehezkel were speaking to and telling the measurements to will actually come back and rebuild the temple themselves. So clearly, we have an explicit prophecy in Tanakh saying that the Jewish people will rebuild the temple and not that it will be built by God. In addition, there is no explicit passage in the Talmud Bavli nor the Talmud Yerushalmi that says that the future temple will be built by God. How could the Talmud and the Tanakh miss such a crazy miracle and not tell us about it in any explicit way? And in fact, we actually see the opposite in the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Talmud Yerushalmi in Megillah 111 explicitly says that the Jewish people will come back, they will awaken from the exile and come back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple. In Megillah 111, based on the verse in Shira Shirim, the Song of Songs 4:16, Uri Tzafon Uvoi Seimon, awaken north and come south, awaken the exiles. New York, LA, London, France are going to awaken one day and they're going to say, oh my gosh, we have to come back and rebuild the temple. That is what it says in the Jerusalem Talmud, Megillah 111. A similar passage, almost identical to what is quoted there in the Jerusalem Talmud, is found in Vayikra Rabbah 9:6 and Shira Shirim Rabbah 4:16, which are all midrashic works, and they quote the same verses and say that the Mashiach, the Messiah himself, will rebuild the temple, explicitly saying that a human or humans will rebuild the final temple. In addition, we have a Tosefta, and the Tosefta is a work that existed in the times of the Mishnah that is very similar to the Mishnah, explicitly says if the Jewish people were given the opportunity to rebuild the temple between Passover and the second Passover mentioned in Bamidbar chapter 9, for those who missed the first Passover sacrifice, there is a makeup a month later that only applies to an individual and not to an entire nation. And thus, the Tosefta tells us that if the Jewish people were given the opportunity to rebuild the temple at such a time, they would not perform the makeup sacrifice. This is also quoted in the Talmud Yerushalmi in Pesahim 9:1. This clearly indicates that if the Jewish people were given the opportunity, the chance, or permission to build the temple, this clearly implies that the temple will be rebuilt by human hands and not by God himself. In addition, historically, there is a precedent brought in the Midrash in Bereishis Rabbah 64:10 that after the destruction of the second temple, the Roman government actually decreed that the temple be rebuilt, and all of the Jewish people gathered in northern Israel to travel down to Jerusalem to rebuild the third temple. However, the Kuthians, which is another group of people that claim to be Jews, wrote to the king and said, if you allow the Jewish people to rebuild the temple, they will not pay taxes. And the king said, but I've already made the decree that they can rebuild the temple, so what shall I do? And the Kuthians said, tell the Jewish people that they must add a little bit or subtract to the measurements of the temple, and they will not build it. And that's what the king did, and the Jewish people ended up not rebuilding the temple. However, it is clear from this story that the Jewish people of the time, who were living post the destruction of the second temple, did not believe that there was going to be a temple that will fall down from the sky built by God. Rather, they all gathered in northern Israel in Beit Rimon to rebuild the third temple that they saw was coming. In addition, almost unanimously, all of the commentators who record the 613 biblical commandments write that there is a biblical commandment from the Torah to rebuild the temple. That includes Rav Sajigon, the Rambam, the Smag, the Sefer HaChinuch, and the Or HaChaim all explicitly say that there is a biblical commandment to rebuild the temple, and none of them mention in any of these works that the temple will be built by God and fall from the sky. Moreover, the Ramban, Nachmanides, one of the most famous commentators on the Torah and the Talmud, in his disputation in Barcelona against the Christians, debating as to whether Jesus was the Messiah, explicitly says that the Messiah will come and the Jewish people will be gathered into Israel and the Messiah will build the temple, and does not say that God himself will build the temple. So clearly, this indicates that the Ramban himself thought that the temple will be built by human hands. The Or HaChaim goes as far as to say that this commandment to rebuild the temple is in existence even in the period of the exile, and the Jews should have done this in the exile. However, you have to build it in Jerusalem, and that was simply not feasible. So we see that there's a clear contradiction between sources. Will the temple be rebuilt by humans, by the Messiah, or by the people, or by the people under the leadership of the Messiah, or will it be built by God and fall from the sky? we see a clear contradiction. So what do we do in order to resolve this contradiction? So if someone takes a literalist approach, you have to pick a side. It cannot fall from the sky and be built by humans. So which side would you take? Well, many sources that have grappled with this question take a non-literalist approach to this topic, and we're going to mention a few of the resolutions mentioned by the sources. So one of the most famous is the Aruch LaNeir, who lived in the 1800s and was a famous commentator on the Talmud, says that of course the temple will be built by humans, and what it means that the temple will be built by God is just like a body on earth needs a soul, so too the temple needs the Spirit of God to rest in it in order for it to transcend simply a physical structure. However, the actual physical structure will be built by human hands. Another resolution brought by the Maharam Shik, who was a student of the Chassam Sofer, says there are really two possibilities. And this is based on the Gemara in Sanhedrin 98, which raises a contradiction between the verse in Yeshaya, Isaiah 60:22, which says that the redemption will come Be'ita achishena, in its time I will hasten it. The Talmud says, well, if it comes in its time, then how is God going to hasten it? And if God's going to hasten it, how is it going to come into its time? So the Talmud says there are actually two possibilities of how the redemption can come. Either it can come at its appointed time if the Jewish people are not worthy of a miracle. But if the people are worthy of a miracle, then I will hasten it, God says, before its appointed time. Based on this, the Maharam Shik says that if the Jewish people are worthy of a miracle, then God will hasten the temple and bring it down himself before its appointed time. And if they are not worthy, then the Jewish people will be forced to build it themselves. An opposite approach brought by Rav Avigdor Neventzal, who lives in the old city of Jerusalem currently, says the exact opposite. That being that there is a biblical commandment to rebuild the temple, and the commandments were given by God to the Jewish people as a merit, if the Jewish people merit, they will build the temple themselves. However, if the Jewish people do not merit to fulfill this commandment, then God will have to bring it down himself. So in conclusion, will the temple be rebuilt by human hands, or will it be built by God himself? I am not a prophet, and I think one of the most important points in this entire discussion is a drop of humility to say, we don't know how these things will happen until they happen. However, being that seemingly unanimously the halachic sources and prophetic sources seem to indicate that people will rebuild the temple, and midrashic sources seem to indicate that the temple will be rebuilt by God, it would be more logical to take the side of the halachic sources, which are there to instruct us what to do, and therefore are to be taken in a more literal way, whereas midrashic sources are often written in an allegorical way and not to be taken literally. The way we should be educating our kids and our future generation is that the Jewish people will actually come back to the land of Israel and rebuild the temple, perhaps under the Messiah, and not that it will fall from the sky built by God. I turn to all the Jewish educators that are educating the Jewish people, our children and our adults, to adopt a wider approach instead of misleading and telling maybe only half of the story to our people. We must tell the full story and say that there actually is a biblical commandment to rebuild the temple. In any case, may we merit to see the fulfillment of V'haya Hashem lemelech al kol haaretz bayomahu yeh Hashem echad ushmo echad, that God's name will be one across the entire earth. May we see this with the rebuilding of the temple and the coming of the Messiah speedily in our days.